another video of Third Take. Here, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about kind of like my theoretical framework in a sense. I'm going to call it like relational pragmatism. That's what I'm going to be talking about today in a sense. I was kind of like meditating and just had this idea kind of like running through my head and stuff like that. So I was like, well, might as well make a video, of it. Kind of like explain a little bit more, kind of like what my theoretical framework is in a sense. And I think that's gonna kind of like help you better understand as I do any like social commentary, anything like that, kind of like where I'm coming through, or kind of like what is it the lens that I'm observing, any event or anything like that. So before I go into kind of like what I call relational pragmatism, first I want to talk about like kind of like what is the theoretical framework in a sense. And I think like in the very simple terms, we can kind of like say that theoretical framework is kind of like the lens in which we view the world in a sense. So for example, depending on your discipline, if you're like in the social sciences, there's a lot of social theories out there that they can help you kind of like build your theoretical framework, or some of those can be kind of like the theoretical framework in which you analyze or view whatever area of interest that you have. And I think like it's very important then kind of like when we're talking about theories and we're talking about kind of like theoretical frameworks in a sense, that we take into account that the theoretical framework is going to first be different depending on the individual, but also it's going to be different depending on the area of interest, what people are interested in for. And for me, like I'm interested more in practice, more like pragmatism. So that's kind of like what I think kind of like relational pragmatism works well. And you'll see why in just a second. So let me put up the screen real quick so that way you guys can see a little bit. So here we have, so this is pretty much so sorry guys, I'm organizing a little bit my area better. Here we go. All right, so this is pretty much was my cultural comps review. So pretty much I did the social cultural well, I did a comprehensive review for my master's degree in anthropology. So when I was doing it, the exam was 1 week, and we had 3 days where we had to answer 3 questions in each day, and then we had 3 hours to answer each question. So pretty much it was like, okay, we're done with day one. Now I need to study for day two. Done with day two. Now I need to go study for day three. Kind of just building on top of each other. The good thing is that some of the ideas you can kind of like piggyback depending on the different subjects that you discuss. But it was definitely an interesting idea. I know one of the professors, Dr. Christine Lee, if I'm not wrong, shout out to her. She was kind of like recently hired to teach bioarchaeology and more on the physical anthropology side. And she says like, man, I feel bad for you guys because this is a bit of a torture. And yeah, she was not right. It was a lot of pressure and tension. It was intense. Like some weeks it was a couple of like an intense month, kind of like getting ready, to get everything settled and kind of like just okay, have everything on point. So because realistically when you were taking this test, like it was an hour per question. That's realistically what I had. I think for this test, the social cultural, I think I had maybe like 5 minutes left when I finished everything. And then I just like 5 minutes just to make sure that there was no errors pretty much in kind of like organizing the my ideas and stuff like that. So making sure everything was like readable, like format wise. um so yeah, so without further ado, I'm kind of like gonna jump right into it. So pretty much my theoretical framework was really built based on the different classes and interaction that I had with my different anthropology professors. And something that it always like stuck with me was in my course it was mm, yeah, method and theory. So teoría y método is the course in UPR Rio Piedras. So there I had a professor called Yvette Chicalana, and something that she said that always like stuck to me was that we're always doing theory. I think like during that time, and I think us as a society sometimes we think that when we think about theory is like someone who's smart, who's like has this level of intellect and academic maybe like accomplishments and achievements. There are the people that are allowed to make theory, but realistically kind of like your interactions and kind of like your day-to-day your day-to-day interactions and kind of like how you view the world can help you shape around your theoretical framework and kind of like what is theory for you. All right, so here really kind of like one at building my theoretical framework. It was really things that I saw that really fit well with kind of like my area of interest and things that I think this is like a different way to see a lens. So kind of like how I say or how I describe like a theoretical framework is similar to having like a camera lens. It's like there are different camera lenses depending on what is it that you're trying to capture, and that is similar with the theoretical framework. Some theoretical frameworks can be applied to different concepts that can be more like adaptable in a sense versus others. So I like to think that mine is a bit more adaptable because it's really focusing on points and then the relationship between, the practice in a sense. So that's something that is like very common in day to day, interest. So I would say kind of like not really mundane, but it can be said kind of like mundane things, but not necessarily for me. I would say more for like it's interesting seeing all these differences, right? So first, I go with Pierre Bourdieu. So he's a sociologist and anthropologist, and really, this book, The Outline of a Theory of Practice, is an extremely dense book. It is really dense, um, but it has really good information. And I really like when I read his book and we discussed this in our social cultural class. I can't remember what the class was. It was with like Dr. Sullivan that I will not forget. Like she's a fantastic professor. For some, she's not everyone's cup of tea, but she's a really good professor, and I really enjoy taking classes with her. She teaches at Cal State LA. I don't know what to say. If they, I know we used to say CSU. I don't know CSULA or Cal State LA. I know they were trying to rebrand or whatever. But anyway, kind of like some of the points when I was reading this book, it was like it really sparkles because I was like this dude is really like talking and kind of like the things that he's presenting are really stuff that is more of my interest, more of the practice. It was more focusing on the praxis and pragmatism. So that's really kind of like what I was more interested in the field of anthropology. So it was like came perfect to me. So some of the points that he talks about, I'm gonna, talk about them real quick. This is a full review, so these are things that I was just like forming around, but I've kind of like fine-tuned a little bit more to kind of get what are the points that I really take more out of this. So the first is habitus. So habitus is defined as the embodiment of cultural capital to the deeply ingrained habits, skills, and disposition that we possess due to our life experiences. Habitus allows successful navigation in social environments. So I think this point is important. It kind of helps to better understand the whole package of where like context matters. Where people like were brought, kind of where they were raised, like all those different interactions matter. Like the context matter in order to understand the bigger picture. So I think a good analogy to the habitus is like, let's say you're from like, the middle, like those are like what is called in the US like flyover states. Let's say you're for like a flyover state, a small town, not a lot of people, not a lot of stuff. Yeah. And then let's say you go to like a big city like LA or New York, it's gonna be a big cultural shock because the habitus in which you're used to is not gonna be the same, you know. So you're gonna have that initial culture shock because the again we can say here the habits, skills, and dispositions that you had prepare you to the environment that you were to your previous environment and not to your current one. So that's where you need to adapt, come into it. But something that when someone experiences culture shock in a sense, it kind of like goes down to doxa where it's like it's the experience by which the natural and social world appears as self-evident. So that initial culture shock that you have, it is to you as a shock because it's not part of your doxa. It's not part of your natural and social element that is not natural to you. That is not your natural environment. So when you jump into this and have this like kind of like cultural shock in a sense, is that you're finding yourself face to face with that doxa, kind of like your doxa is clashing with the other doxa because your natural and social order, kind of like how you were brought up in your context, is not the same as the environment that you are right now. However, this does not mean that this is detrimental to you as an individual because as you go through and you're gonna how to say, like, as you, have more experiences in this new environment, your habitus is going to adapt, and then you're going to be able to adapt to this situation. So let's say, for example, you go to a different big city, so you go from New York to LA, then it's not going to be such a drastic or big change, because your habitus and your former doxa, so your former habitus and doxa have prepared you, have given you the experiences, the skill set, in order for you to be able to adapt, to this new and different environment. Pretty much kind of like that's how they kind of change. So for example, when I was in chiropractic school, right? As a student, so when I came into chiropractic school, I had the experience of a graduate program. So for me, it was a bit of a shock in a sense. And I was talking with a buddy of mine who's treating me, where, like I said, that for me, chiropractic school felt like high school for adults. Like all the stuff that I saw in high school, kind of the cliques and all that kind of like dynamics between high school, I saw very similar dynamics when I was in chiropractic school. Like very similar. Like it was just like I just said, it sounded to me like a high school for adults. Again, there is exceptions, to like me and other individuals. For example, when I was in chiropractic school, like I didn't care about grades. All that I care about was like the knowledge that I have in order to be a good provider once I get my license and I'm out there. Like having an A in biochemistry, or like um human biology, and that wasn't human biology. It was like ah, the one with like viewing this histology. That's the one. Like, who cares? Like, no one's gonna come see me. It's like, oh yeah, what grade you had in your histology class, or like or your biochemistry class? No one cares. It's like, can you help me with my pain and what I have? And those were the skill sets that I really focus on. But I already had the experience of being in a grad school, in a sense. So chiropractic school for me, in the sense of the pressure, was not a big change. The big change for me was like adapting to coming from a discipline where I'm doing essays and I'm writing my ideas, kind of like building arguments, to just multiple choice, pure memorization and regurgitation. And that for me was a big kind of change that I really was never able to adapt to that by environment. Again, it was just like, again, when I built my theoretical framework and all the stuff and my experiences that I had in my graduate program, in my anthropology courses, I was more resistant to just like this, just, bottle it up and regurgitate. I really wanted to like distillate this information and really have it part of like, okay, no, like these are skills that I need to understand. These are things that I need to have. And this is just not like, my knowledge is not going to be just to like memorize and regurgitate for a test. Like this has, pragmatic implications, and I need to be cognizant of that as well. So it was interesting, kind of like, again, as you jump in different spaces, this thing can be said when I went to my graduate program for my master's in Cal State LA for my anthropology program. I started as a forensic anthropology major. And then I switched in my second year to bioarch, because I saw from the forensic program I was not really going to graduate on time. The director of that program, she was behind reading thesis. So I was like, yeah, like I'm not graduate here on time. So I think so that's why I switched to bioarch. Actually, I switched to the archaeology program, and the archaeology professor, Dr. Brady, fantastic human being. So me and him, we got along really well. So yeah, I spoke to him. It's like, hey, can you help me get graduated soon? He's like, yep. I was like, there we go, perfect. So that's kind of like how it came out to be that I switched. But before that, it was interesting because I did have like practical experience. For example, I took a course in forensic anthropology with my old mentor, who's not here with us, Dr. Edwin Crespo, and he was the renowned forensic anthropologist in Puerto Rico. Like he was the dude. Um, I don't think there's anyone else. I don't think there's any other forensic anthropologists now in the island that I'm aware of, but I could be wrong. So he, like, when he gave us the forensic anthropology course, he gave us like I took bioarchaeology from him and forensic anthropology. Those are the two courses I think I took from him. Maybe one more, but I'm not entirely sure if I did or not. I'm guessing there's one more that I'm missing, but I can't remember. the course. But I do remember that when we did the forensic anthropology course, it pretty much like took us like, this is how you go through a scene. Like when you go to a crime scene, these are the steps that you take. Like this is how you develop the perimeter and stuff like that. We saw some gruesome pictures from some crime scenes that he had been to. I remember this one was like really insane. This crime in Puerto Rico where this dude killed his wife and then chopped her up, put her in some like barrels, and then the arms and the legs, he put them inside his tires of his car. Insane, like just weird, just insane stuff. How everything was preserved, and so it was just it was a bit like shocking in a sense. And the other thing too, I remember seeing like an autopsy, just like a very recent autopsy, just someone who just recently passed away. And that was like seeing that initially kind of made me a little bit like warm inside and a bit like queasy, but then I like kind of like got into it and it was easier to manage. But it was just it was a really cool experience, that I had. That when I went to my graduate program, the forensic anthropology program, I already had some practical experience. I maybe was not as well versed in the theoretical portion as most of my classmates because realistically I was not. Like theory with me was not really big. It was not something. It was something that I was shown in Puerto Rico. We're taught about it, but it was just like, how do we go more to the practice of it? Because a lot of my professors were not trained in the U.S. They were trained in either in Latin America, so like Mexico or Europe. So that's kind of like the school of thought and practice that I came with. So I think my doxa as and my habitus, in the academic portion of anthropology, when I went to my master's degree, was like very different, and I saw the differences, between our programs and the experiences that we had, right? So then we have some other points here, like cultural capital and social capital, but really I don't really like my framework doesn't really focus so much as it on those elements, although these are both like important elements. For example, so I'm gonna read them. All right, so I thought I was recording this, but anyway, for cultural capital, this says that the collection of symbolic elements such as skills, states, posture, clothing, mannerism, material belongings, credentials, etc., that one acquires through being part of a particular social class. Sharing similar forms of cultural capital with others creates a sense of collective identity and group position. So, for example, we can say like cultural capital can be similar to like if we talk about like class dynamics, like people who are in different like social stratum are going to have different cultural like different experiences, although they all may share a similar cultural background as a national identity. Within that national identity, there are different stratums or stratums within that societal distribution in the social contract. And this is where like cultural capital is like, okay, part of like it helps identify different groups. So it's like similar to identify let's say between like here in the US we can even see it as just someone who has like higher income with someone lower income. You can see kind of like some of the potentially like music they consume, kind of art they consume, food they consume, and stuff like that. I'm not saying that this is how to say like very distinctive of social classes, because there could be some people who like who are like high class that still enjoy things that would be considered like low class in a sense. So but even having me the discussion and presenting this point, you can see kind of like how that cultural capital could work depending on where the value of that cultural element is within society. And then social capital, kind of the aggregate of the actual or potential resources which are linked to possession of a durable network of more or less institutionalized relationship of mutual acquaintance and recognition. Really kind of like this is part of like Bourdieu, but I don't really kind of like this doesn't really work from kind of like how I develop more of my framework in a sense. I do like though the habitus and the doxa, those are very important because that gives you context, it's like context between A and B, or whatever, A and B, the 2 points, like what is their context, what is their position and how that position relates to each other, kind of like that's where it goes, part of the relationism that I'm talking about. And then we have also like Moss, which is anthropologist as well, that he says like habitus, like those aspects of culture that are anchored in the body or daily practices of individuals, groups, societies, and nations. So habitus is not necessarily like a habit. So because like eating your nails, that is a habit, but a habitus could be just how do you interpret, certain cues, certain social cues, certain like environments or like social interactions, that's more of what habitus is. So when we go, so for me, like I think in a nutshell, habitus is what provides the context, like the context between the 2 points. Like where are these 2 points, where they're parting from? What is the contextual, the contextual element, the contextual relationship within those points in which the interaction is occurring. Then I go to Michel Foucault, and then let me turn this again down again. So Michel Foucault is more like a historian and philosopher. So, and then with him, kind of the big element that I take from him is power, and his take of power, I think is for me, was very interesting when I like read him. Because I read him in my undergrad, but I didn't really understand him that well. But when I read him again in my graduate program, I was like, oh, okay, now this makes more sense. Like, okay, I'm like, this is something that really, caught my attention as well, because Michel Foucault, how he describes power is like power is not a thing but a relation. Power is not simply repressive, but it's productive. Let me move this out of the way. He says like power is not simply a property of the state. Power is not something that is exclusively localized in government and the state. Rather, power is exercised throughout the social body. He says that power operates at the most micro levels of social relations. Power is omnipresent at every level of the social body, and then the exercise of power is strategic and warlike. And then something else that he says is like resistance as a response to the exercise of power. So why do I want to bring in this portion of like what power is, and why I think I'm gonna make a bit bigger point on this is that kind of how it says like power is something that is exercised, right? So when we look at a relationship, so for example, we look at the habitus and all that stuff, is that those social conventions have to be exercised every day. So part of the social contract is exercising those social conventions, those elements that form the habitus and the doxa, that has to be exercised every day. So sometimes when we think about like cultures and we think about, any cultural elements, we think of them as like monolithic, something that has always been there, something that, since the beginning of time, this has always been a cultural thing. No, is that these are cultural values because we exercise those values, because we put importance in those values. So we are exercising the importance of those values for us as a society in the social contract. And when he says kind of like the power is not, this is why power is not only on the state. It's not only like the state does not own power, because, a mother and child, or a parent and a child, like that parent is exercising their power over the child. They're exercising the power over the relationship they have with that individual, that is their child, right? And then if the child throws a temper tantrum, that is a reaction to the exercise of the power of their parents. So it is the symbol of resistance. However, the child has to exercise that resistance as well. And the exercise of the resistance is through the temper tantrum that the kid is throwing. So it's kind of like, okay, then what is the relationship between A and B, and how that relationship is being exercised? So something that I argue, or how I define culture in a sense, part of it is that is what is that relationship? What is the pragmatic relationship between that? Because I think that is important, how that is exercised. So for example, when I go back on Pierre Bourdieu, on the book of like his like outline of a practice of a theory, I think it's called, yeah, outline of a theory of practice. All right, there we go. So on his book, I know he has a really interesting example. Oh, I can't really remember what tribe or like kind of what region it is, but I do remember seeing that there was this group of individuals where um you had to be married by cousins, right? So marriage had to be done by cousins. So when he looked at kind of like, okay, realistically, how many people are actually marrying, their biological cousins, I think it was like less than 25%. And I think that is a lot. So he was like, okay, then how is this kind of like social habitus? How does this, societal context, and how do people satisfy this social schema and kind of like this requirement? And the way in which that was satisfied is that what they did was they adopted the male into the family, and by adopting the male into a family, that in essence will make him a cousin, and that would satisfy the requirement that people had to be married by cousins. You know, so it is interesting how, and that's kind of like what I personally like more, and kind of like where I focus more on my theoretical kind of like a lens, in a sense. How do my theoretical framework, frames more kind of like how I view maybe social interaction and other elements, is that, that is what I'm interested in. Is like, what is it that you say and what you do, and like how that is made, like how do you represent the idea into the concrete, that's more. And then again, we have like art and cars, engineering, stuff like that elements that represent the ideas into a concrete, space. But those not necessarily mean that there are like cultural elements into it, because a car is not a cultural element. A car is an instrument, a vehicle, again, a vehicle in which we can use for, transportation. So I don't view it more as a cultural element. However, there is a subculture of like cars, we have like muscle cars and like exotic cars and all this other stuff, that is just a congregation of people really kind of like enjoying a part of, life that they enjoy, and they have like representation, there is that, yeah, like personal representation into your product of what you're putting out. So people like deck their cars and stuff like that. There is, that personal representation in that object that the individual is putting out, right? So that's more kind of like this. The element, like Michel Foucault has more stuff, and I have more stuff here, but this really is more so like was more so for my exam and other arguments that I was building, but not necessarily for the framework that I want. Kind of says like institutions, like not individuals. So pretty much like power is more um kind of like a part. All this is like power is not necessarily a part of an institution, and like the institution is not an individual as well. So kind of like we have like Citizens United, or like here in the US, where like a corporation is thought to be like as a person, stuff like that. That is, it's like that is not true. Kind of like what he pretty much puts into it. You can read more of it as I'm gonna keep discussing other stuff here, and then if you're interested into dealing more with it, then hopefully this like piques your curiosity, and you can kind of check these different people that I'm talking about more. And then the last person is like Joe Robbins, is an anthropologist, and then pretty much he talks more about relationships. So Joe Robbins and Marilyn Strathern are part of like kind of like relationism, in a sense. So they focus more on the kind of like relationships, and like the big tenets with them is pretty much that starting point is the relationship instead of the individual. And then the relationships are more important than just the individual. And why does he say this? Is that pretty much in this um article, I'm not sure, kind of like an expert or kind of like essay, in a sense, he talks about kind of like how in Melanesia, how the judicial system, kind of like the Western judicial system, clashes with the Melanesian judicial system, kind of more of that old school tribal type of judicial system, because that old school type of like judicial system that they have really focuses more on like retribution is for both parties, to the afflicted party and the party, who did the action. Because for them, what is not important is the parties per se, is the relationship between the parties. So when like a damage is done, the retribution that is given to both parties is not necessarily a individual retribution. It's more retribution to heal and strengthen the relationship between the groups. Like the individuals are not important. So let's say we got two tribal members of different tribes, and then something happened. The tribal members per se are not important. What is important is maintaining the good relationship between the two tribes, because at the end of the day, the individuals that may come and go, like they may grow old, they may die, they move somewhere else, but the relationship between the two tribes is still there, and that still needs to be maintained. So for them, what is important is the relationship between the two tribes versus the like compensation to the group or the individual per se. Like the relationship is what is important, not necessarily the individuals. So when I look at everything, kind of like I look at it is, okay, then my theoretical framework is, okay, then what is the relationship between A and B, and then what is being exercised in that relationship? um so let's say, again, like when I was doing my comprehensive exam, I talk about like syncretism, and the argument that I used for syncretism was that like Santeria and voodoo, like Cuban Santeria and Haitian voodoo, they're the direct product of like syncretism with the like Catholic religion, you know. And then the way in which the syncretism came to be, so the mixing of these two religious elements to form a new religious identity was, was a relationship between, the oppressor and the oppressee, the people who are being oppressed. So Cuban Santeria and Cuban Santeria and Haitian Voodoo, they come from they're part of the Yoruba religion. So they kind of like people who practice the Yoruba religion, of those people who were slaves, were brought, to the Caribbean, to a different island in the Caribbean, in Central and South America. um so kind of like they the way in which they were able to practice, their beliefs and their pretty much the idea was by taking Christian symbology and adapting that symbology to their rituals. So the relationship, kind of what gave birth, or the product of the relationship of power between the oppressor, those, the slave owners and the ones who had the slaves, and more specifically here, the imposition of the Catholic religion to to the slaves, produce the syncretism, produce the Santeria and the voodoo, because it was a symbol of resistance from these people. It was a symbol of resistance from the slaves to the power of the Catholic, the Catholic imposition, of the that religious ideology being imposed on them, and that's kind of how it came to be. So when I looked at the element, was okay, Santeria is a product of a relationship between the Catholic idea and the Catholic religion to the Yoruba religion. That's it. That's how it came out to be, And then the power dynamic that happened between them, so that was the result of the Santeria. So the exercise of resistance towards the power of the Catholic captors was, that product of that resistance was Santeria in Cuba, and then the Haitian voodoo in Haiti as well. So I think like that's why, when I'm looking at stuff, when I looked at different social interactions and I looked at maybe social things, I'm looking at more so of, like what is the relationship between the elements and stuff like that. So one of the videos that I did, kind of like um the last one that I put up, regarding kind of like some of YouTube drama, and using one of the individual, like using some of that product to illustrate, hey, like we can be better and stuff like that. So there's one individual that I talked about in that video, where he says something is like, said, look, I had to, like, an action that he took is like, how he framed it was like, I had to, you know. So that and I think I brought that up in a little bit, and the reason why I'm bringing it up here is that, that the relationship that individual had with a specific podcast, which prompted him to take the action that he took, was that direct relationship between A and B. And I think that's kind of part of what I've seen in a lot of more of like discussion regarding this issue, is that the representation, the relationship between A and B is creating a product that not necessarily is good for society. That is the argument that I've heard so far, regarding the situation there. But even so, when the individual, if I analyze that thing, he said like, no, I had to. The reason why he did the action that he did, because he had to do it, not that he chose to do it. And I think that is something very important, because when we're talking about, again, if we're talking about this human interaction, I'm going to use it as an example to demonstrate kind of like more my theoretical framework, is that individual, like, the framing of his idea does not correlate with the action that he took. So he didn't have to send the message that he sent. He chose to send the message that he sent. Like, he chose to react in a way to the situation, to the information that the podcasters were saying, and he chose to act on that. He chose to exercise his power, and write the message that he wrote. So the relationship, that between the podcaster and its listener, the product of that relationship was that gentleman choosing to write a inappropriate message to a fellow Instagrammer and content creator. That was it, but there was that relationship, between that podcast and that listener, the product. So again, the relationship of power was that. So because there is a power relationship. And I think that sometimes we don't think about it, but there's a power dynamic always happening between us. Like, it doesn't mean like power, like, oh, I'm stronger than you, or I'm imposing myself onto you, like in a drastic, or more like a more visual way, in a sense. But there is kind of like when you're talking with someone, hey, no, like, I prefer this or prefer that, like when you're argumenting and you're presenting your ideas, there is a power relationship and a power play happening during that. Because I think we think about power like something that, like a whip, or something that is negative, and necessarily that is not the case. It does not have to be something negative. It's not that. It's just something that is wielded and it's exercised, and how that is exercised is how we use it. So what is the relationship between the idea and the representation as well too? So that can be the same with like art, so the same thing. So when someone's doing something like a piece of art or anything like that, is like there is a representation that is being implemented there. And then what is the relationship between that idea and the object, and how that is presented? Because that relationship between the idea and the and the palpable, what we're able to touch and see and maybe like experience, that in itself is part of kind of like, okay, then how that came to be, what is the thinking to doing what you did, and I think that's part of like the relationship between A and B. So if someone does harms you, or does something about negative like that, is like, okay, then you were like you're maybe point B, that person is point A, and then what is the relationship between you guys? Like, why was that outcome? Like, what were the contexts that led to that outcome? So like action and consequence. So and that relationship with the action and the consequence is kind of like the backstory of like, okay, then what are the things that potentially could have happened in order for this action to happen, and for this consequence to appear due to the action taken. So I think that's more kind of like what I want to talk about. And then I know maybe I wasn't necessarily as concrete with some other stuff. I think it's a bit hard to be more concrete with that, but I just wanted to show kind of like the diversity that potentially this has, that you can use or stuff like that. I'm not saying that this is the end all be all, this is like a fantastic way of viewing the world or anything like that. It's just more like, this is how I view the world, like the theoretical framework and lens that I use to view kind of like some issues or anything like that I see is like, hey, like, what is the relationship between these 2 points, and then and how that relationship is being exercised, what are the elements that are being exercised in order for that outcome to happen, so I hope you enjoy the video, and I hope you have a wonderful day.